Hello, and welcome to my summary and commentary of Part 13 of the Introduction to Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. This is a very good section for three reasons in particular. First, I think Spengler does a great job of illustrating his idea of the civilizational phase of a high culture through the example of Rome. Second, we get Spengler's opinion at length about why Cecil Rhodes is such an important harbinger of the future of the West to him. And third, there's a very prescient prediction about socialism that Spengler makes. So let's get into it. So the first point, is that the Roman world dominion was a negative phenomenon. Romans did not conquer. They merely took possession of a booty that lay open to everyone. So Spengler views the East, the Greek East, the Hellenistic East at this point, as very weak, as exhausted, and the Romans as really just kind of the last man standing of the classical culture. So his counterintuitive historiography is on full display here, because most people wouldn't view Rome in that way at all. And he says the Punic Wars, so the wars against Carthage, which we spoke a little bit about in the last section, were Rome's finest hour, and the exhausted men of the East, the exhausted former Diadochi empires of the East, the Diadochi are the successors of Alexander, these were merely easy pickings by the time the Romans conquered them, or not even conquered them, right? In Spengler's conception, they just took possession of a booty open to all. And he says Pompey and Lucullus, famous generals of the 1st century BC, Pompey, of course, for his rivalry with Caesar, which was ended at the Battle of Pharsalus, and Lucullus, kind of famous as a dissolute Roman general. He had some success in Asia Minor, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. A great deal of success. This was a very prosperous region in those times. And Lucullus has had some success there, and he became massively wealthy because, the Roman generals would take a lot of booty. You could also, at that time, kind of buy a contract with the Roman state where you would say, okay, I'll give you X number of, let's just call them dollars for the moment. I'll give you X number of dollars each year from this province, and then you go to that province and you extract as much as you can over that figure that you've promised Rome, and that's going to be your profit. So Lucullus made a lot of money that way. He was known as very dissolute by the end because he was very bitter because his command was taken. So he went back to Italy and he would just throw these insane parties and he was just insanely wasteful. He's the type who would eat a bunch of food and then puke it up and then eat more, stuff like that. So the kind of the height of Roman decadence, some people might think. But he says Pompey and Lucullus, with a few ill-trained, ill-led legions, were able to conquer whole realms, and this never could have happened 200 or 300 years before, when the East still had its strength, because the soul still had its life force. It hadn't become exhausted in this about 1,000-year life cycle of a culture. And he says the Eastern Wars and the Gallic conquest, so that's what Caesar was very famous for before he became dictator for life and is killed on the Ides of March and all of that. So he has this big conquest in Gaul. He even goes all the way to Britain, which he doesn't conquer. It's conquered later during the reign of Claudius. But, so he's the first one to go there, at least. And he did, a number of things, particularly some of his engineering feats are tremendous. I mean, there's these guys from Switzerland, the Helvetii, they wanted to migrate over to France, or modern-day France, Gaul at the time. And Caesar just built a big wall in the way. He's like, nope, you ain't going nowhere. And then they would build bridges over the Rhine, go over, beat the crap out of people, then come back and dismantle the whole bridge. It's very interesting, his conquest. But he says these Eastern Wars and Gallic conquests, these are merely colonial endeavors. These aren't the greatness of the time of the Punic Wars. And he says their grand hour was Cannae, and this is really the height of Spengler's counterintuitive historiography right here, because the Battle of Cannae was a disaster for the Romans. This is when Hannibal's the great Carthaginian general. He's very famous for taking his elephants and all of his troops over the Alps into Italy. Famous because of the difficulty of the journey, but also because it was so difficult, it was so surprising. It was a master strategic stroke for him to cross the Alps into Italy, because the Romans would have been expecting the Carthaginians, these great maritime people, they would have been expecting them to come across the Mediterranean Sea, a much easier route. But by coming over the Alps, he gets a big element of surprise. So at Cannae, though, there's a council. I forget his name. He's far lesser. Well, it's a name that should be forgotten. But he wants to give Hannibal battle. He's not listening to Quintus Fabius Maximus, who's not yet cunctator, but is on his way to becoming this great name. And he gives Hannibal battle, and it's a renowned battle. People say that Hannibal's generalship in this battle is one of the greatest examples of ancient generalship. Anyway, for Spengler to say that their grand hour was Cannae is very interesting, because this is considered the greatest loss for the Roman army. There's two really big losses for the Roman army that are, probably three. So the first is Cannae. The second rhymes with Cannae, Kahrai. That's my best attempt. So Carrhae, which is in Syria. So this one's famous because the triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, he takes these legions. He's the richest man in Rome. He and Caesar are very good allies. Well, Caesar needs the money, and Crassus needs the life force that Caesar brings, the great talent that Caesar has. And this is in 53 BC, and Crassus's death is enormously important for the fall of the Roman Republic, because then Pompey and Caesar fully break, because Crassus kind of brought them together. But anyway, Crassus goes into Syria, and Syria is still pretty strong at this point. I mean, Spengler can say what he likes about, well, Spengler would view it as this, these weren't the Seleucids at this point, and were they the Sassanids or the Parthians? They were the Parthians at this point. So the Parthians are a Persian people. They're an Iranian people. They, like all the Iranian peoples, they came from Central Asia originally and were great horsemen, and then they settle in the Iranian plateau and in the Fertile Crescent. And this happened a number of times. The original Iranians, then the Parthians, then you get the Scythians, you get all these waves of Iranian peoples from Central Asia. And it's a broader trend of Indo-Europeans at first, and then later the Mongols and the Turks, great steppe riders that continue to come into the Middle East and Europe, and China as well, and wreak havoc. But by this time, the Parthians were very much a settled empire, but very strong, particularly with cavalry, as their Central Asian origin would indicate. And the Parthians, their capital was still called Seleucia, though, because this was basically Babylon, but Seleucus, the great Diadochi, most people don't think of any of the Diadochi as being very great. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antipater, these guys. But the name of the capital city was Seleucia, and Crassus says to the Parthians bring, an envoy to him, and he says, "I'll give you my response in Seleucia." So he goes, and, they try to defeat the Parthians, and they just suffer a terrible defeat at Carrhae. The Romans lose legions. Crassus's son is killed. Crassus sees that they killed his son before they killed him, and they had the son's head up on a pike, if I remember correctly, or if the legend is true. And the legend is also, once they captured Crassus, because he was the richest man in Rome, the punishment they chose for him was they killed him by forcing him to drink molten gold, which is similar. You see a little bit of it in, I believe it's the first season of Game of Thrones, where those they're basically like Mongols. I forget what their name is in that kind of stupid series, but Jason Momoa's character, he makes that really shitty Targaryen who, like, everybody hates. He makes that molten crown for him and pours it on his head. Very redolent of what happened to Crassus after Carrai. Sorry, I had to try that again. So that when you see that H after a double R, that means it's a Greek name originally. And you're going to try to trill that R the way you would in Spanish, and then to a lesser extent Italian or Russian. But you're going to try to kind of release an H when you do that to prevent yourself from vibrating your vocal cords, to prevent it from being a voiced sound. So that's my little linguistic detour. Sorry for that. And then the third great loss of the Romans during the height of their powers would be the Teutoburg Forest. So this was during the reign of Augustus, and this is famous because, well, there were a few famous guys in Roman history named Varus or Varus, and this guy Varus lost these legions out in the German forest, and, it was a big loss. It was the first kind of big loss that the Romans ever had against a Germanic barbarian force. So anyway, it's very strange for Spengler to call Cannae the Romans' greatest moment, and it's almost humorous in a way, but it also indicates a lot about Spengler's deeper philosophy. He believes you're at your greatest moment when you're facing your greatest competitor. And, he could have said the Battle of Zama, because that's where Scipio Africanus is able to finally fully defeat the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War. But he doesn't. He speaks of the great defeat to Hannibal, because Hannibal was like the greatest general of that day. And actually, after Hannibal gets exiled from Carthage, and then he goes to the Greek East, and he's an important general over there, even after this time. So it's very interesting, his life story. It should be a movie. I mean, why they put all this crap on my screen when they still haven't done a good Hannibal biopic? Okay, sorry. And then he compares this Roman greatness at Cannae, and then in the times of the Punic Wars, he compares it to Prussian-German greatness, and he says there's three great moments for the Prussian Germans. 1813, so we spoke about that in the last part. That's the Battle of Leipzig. And, why does he pick the Battle of Leipzig? I was thinking again, and is it just because there's no English forces there? I think it must be. I mean, this guy really is biased in favor of Germany. There's no other way to put it. So he says 1813, 1870... That's the Franco-Prussian War. That actually creates the modern German state, because you have this North German Confederation that's able to march on Paris, and that was like the original Treaty of Versailles. So there was a lot of symbolism in the end of World War I, with the French and the English really sticking it to the Germans at Versailles. That was very, very important for the French. So anyway, then he also says 1914. He says 1914 is a moment of German greatness. A moment of great arrogance, a moment of greatly daring, and daring to one's doom, perhaps. But here we see Spengler kind of belie his claims to be utterly free from prepossessions. He's used this word, world history only reveals itself to the man utterly free from prepossessions. Well, so world history does not reveal itself to Spengler, if this is our standard, because he's obviously pro-German to an extent that is irrational, to say the least. So, there's a lot of problems here in terms of the consistency of his thought. Now, for many German philosophers, consistency is just kind of a nuisance, in a way that for an English-speaking philosopher it might not be. I mean, there's guys like Kant, who he's truly good. I mean, I don't particularly enjoy his philosophy or delve into it that much, but I wouldn't put that calumny on him, but the post-Hegelian German philosophers are just generally bullshit artists, and that needs to be pointed out every moment of every day. I mean, not every moment of every day, but anytime the thing comes up. You cannot stress enough that the post-Hegelian German philosophers, outside of Schopenhauer's kind of a contemporary of Hegel, and Nietzsche. I mean, Eric Vogelin had pretty harsh remarks about Nietzsche that I'm not sure Nietzsche really deserved, because I don't think he's even close to the level of a Marx or a Hegel in terms of just being a bullshit artist sorcerer. But, you know, that's obviously an aside. Anyway, on to the next point. Imperialism is the symbol of a culture passing away. A very counterintuitive view, and this is why we love Spengler, because he gives us these thought-provoking, counterintuitive insights. And he says, an imperial civilization may leave petrifacts, so artifacts, but he's stressing the stone nature of it, the lifeless, brittle, stone-like nature of these artifacts. It may leave petrifacts that last thousands of years, but they are dead bodies, amorphous and dispirited masses of men, scrap material from a great history. So this is his view about the post-cultural people, the civilizational people. In Spengler's view, are really no different than barbarians. And the more you look around today, I mean, just look at a weird, interesting phenomenon. People with tattoos. Okay, I mean, you might like tattoos. You might think it's sexy or whatever. I don't know. I never planned to get a tattoo. That's certainly not me. Like, dude, my last name's Smith. Okay, I'm not getting a fucking tattoo. You know, just look at that. So that's a barbaric practice, obviously. Tattoos developed from people who were in barbarism. Now, you're not allowed to say that anymore. Every culture is equal, just like every language is equal, just like every man is equal. And you've got to just assert these shibboleths with absolutely no critical thought if you want to be accepted in kind of mainstream society. But is that worth it? I don't know. I mean, if you're starving, I guess, but if you've got enough to eat, I don't think it's worth giving up your dignity. On that note, just to compare him with Gustave Le Bon once again here, this dispirited masses of men, this scrap material. So we can see, again, Le Bon's idea about the return to barbarism that happens once you lose that unifying, integrating ideal, and there's no longer a cohesive force between the people, either internally or externally between different people. And these kind of dispirited masses of men that are amorphous, these are kind of the building blocks for the force men of Caesarism. Later in this chapter, in this section, Spengler uses this term force men, or Atkinson does in translating him. And I think it's a pretty interesting one. Again, you know, one of these kind of German words that you've got to just translate by a hyphenated English noun. But these force men of Caesarism, they're going to be the only true organic force to Spengler during this civilized phase, because they have that animal instinct to just this will to power. So obviously a very, very Germanic idea, but perhaps it does have some usefulness for our analytical toolkit. On to the next, he says, imperialism is civilization unadulterated, in which phenomenal form the destiny of the West is now irrevocably set. Imperialism is civilization unadulterated, and the West is now irrevocably set in this form because of its destiny. So the deep fatalism in Spengler's view. His view is very fatalistic, it's very cyclical, and it's very discrete. Each culture is its own cycle, and there's no linear relationship between them. And now he starts to speak about the importance of Cecil Rhodes, or Cecil Rhodes, if you prefer. I say Cecil because I'm from America. But Cecil Rhodes, wait, I'm almost lying to myself there. But so Cecil Rhodes, he speaks of now, and I'd like to quote directly from him. So he says, "The energy of culture man is directed inwards, that of civilization man outwards, and thus I see in Cecil Rhodes the first man of a new age. He stands for the political style of a far-ranging Western, Teutonic, and especially German future. And his phrase, 'expansion is everything,' is the Napoleonic reassertion of the indwelling tendency of every civilization that has fully ripened, Roman, Arab, or Chinese." So, obviously some kind of resounding words about Rhodes. Now, on one level, Spengler's completely wrong because the Germans have not produced anyone like Cecil Rhodes, and this future was not particularly German. But you can see how these sort of remarks might have inspired the Nazis a little bit, and that's somewhat troubling, I think, for most people, and myself included. And that's the problem, I think, with some of Spengler's thought, particularly the fatalism is always going to have a self-fulfilling aspect to it. If you believe you have no hope, or if you believe this is the only way, well, then quickly that belief is going to become a reality. So I'd just like to put that down right there. Anyway, he says this expansive tendency is a doom, something daimonic and immense. And you could also pronounce that demonic, but he's really meaning daimonic. So daimon in Greek means more of just a spirit, kind of a lesser god that has great power, though, that can impel people in certain ways. Like each person has their own daimon. Somebody who's a happy person is in eudaimonia. They have a good daimon. So it's just interesting. Excuse me, jeez. So anyway, he says that Rhodes is the precursor of Western Caesarism. He's midway between Napoleon and Spengler thinks that Napoleon and Alexander are both romantics, and that certainly rings true, particularly with Alexander. I mean, the whole idea to conquer the Persian Empire and to try to conquer the ends of the earth, a very, very romantic notion in this broader philosophical sense. I mean, obviously it's not related to your girlfriend and things like that, but so he views Rhodes as midway between Napoleon and the forcemen of the next centuries. The forcemen of the next centuries. So, have we really seen these forcemen that Spengler predicts yet? I don't think we quite have. Does that mean he's wrong? No, because he leaves this period open until about 2200, 2300. He thinks the West should really kind of fall as a civilization by like 2300 at the outset. And I was thinking at the end of this chapter we'll go through his charts at the end of the book, because I think we'll have a good enough foundation to go through those, and that will give us more of a specific idea about the timelines that he sees for each culture. And he says, and he compares Rhodes to Gaius Flaminius as this kind of midway point. So he views Flaminius as a midway point between Alexander and Caesar. So Flaminius is famous just for, in this sense, for conquering Cisalpine Gaul. So the nearer side of the Alps, this part of Gaul. So not yet going over the Alps. We would basically still consider it part of the Italian peninsula today. I think it's basically like Lombardy, like areas like that. It might be a little bit different, but northern Italy. And he says Rhodes is very important because his power is not embodied in any constitutional office. It's this very informal power that he wields, and it's mostly based on his money power, because Rhodes first developed his power Well, Rhodes was actually a sickly kid from England who got sent to South Africa because the climate was supposed to be better for his lungs, if you can believe it, just as a teenager. And he starts working in the diamond mines down there. And he figures out, well, especially with diamonds, I think this is kind of more of a natural insight because diamonds get their value totally just from their aesthetic value and from what, it's much more subjective than most commodities. So he realizes, hey, if we can just control the supply, if we can choke the supply, diamonds are going to make us all a lot of money. But as long as we're competing in a free market and we're trying to produce as much supply as possible, diamonds could become like peanuts. So he corners the supply of diamonds, creating the De Beers De Beers Consolidated Limited, I believe. De Beers is one of the name of the famous mines there, the Kimberley mines. So, and there's great resources on YouTube if you'd like to watch. There's a great BBC series, about 8 episodes, which is tremendous. And then there's this other one, I forget the guy, Kenneth Griffith, a 1971 documentary about Rhodes called A Bit of Churchill, A Bit of Hitler, which is a very, very fun as well. But I would suggest the miniseries. I mean, it really shows you the drama of Rhodes's life and everything. And my understanding from the documentary is actually it's pretty accurate. So none of his power is embodied in a constitutional office in South Africa, although at one point he does become the prime minister of South Africa, but that's not really the source of his power. And then later on, of course, Zimbabwe and Zambia are one country, and they're called Rhodesia at this point, because he's able to conquer them looking for more resources, and he wants to make a big railway all the way from Cape Town to Cairo and a telegraph line. He has these big dreams. And Rhodes died at 48. He didn't even make it to 50, but he had accomplished so much. But his dying words were, "So much to do, so little done." Very interesting. And he says, this man like Rhodes and these civilization men, these force men that arise, it's the end of the idea of state service, which would be a noble idea. That's what the traditional nobility would think of. And it's the beginning of the will to power. And I think there's a great quote here on 50 about 50 and 51 about Rhodes. It says, "But even for Rhodes, political success means territorial and financial success, and only that. Of this Romanness within himself he was fully aware, but Western civilization has not yet taken shape in such strength and purity as this." Again, for Spengler, purity is a very important concept, the purity of the symbolic form. And this is the same with Goethe. And I think this is a bit of quackery to a certain extent. I don't know. I don't know how much purity is really what's driving things here. I think Spengler's really strong when he's just making his analogies. I think he's weaker when he's trying to build up his theoretical framework for it. Anyway, he says, "It was only before his maps that he could fall into a sort of poetic trance. This son of the parsonage, who sent out to South Africa without means, made a gigantic fortune and employed it as the engine of political aims. His idea of a trans-African railway from the Cape to Cairo, his project of a South African empire, his intellectual hold on the hard metal souls of the mining magnates, whose wealth he forced into the service of his schemes, his capital, Bulawayo, royally planned as a future residence by a statesman who was all-powerful, yet stood in no definite relation to the state, his wars, his diplomatic deals, his road systems, his syndicates, his armies, his conception of the great duty to civilization, of the man of brain. All this broad and imposing is the prelude of a future which is still in store for us, and with which the history of West European mankind will be definitely closed." Quite a quote, I think, but I hope you enjoyed that. Anyway, he also speaks about Life is the process of affecting possibilities. So this gets back to the title of Volume 1, Form and Actuality. Life is the process of affecting possibilities, actualizing the possibilities. And he says socialism, today socialism, where it is, here's this quote on 49. He says, hard as the half-developed socialism of today is fighting against expansion, one day it will become Arch-Expansionist, with all the vehemence of destiny. And this was written in 1918, published long before the USSR or China had expansionistic views, expansionistic ambitions. So most people, myself included, view this as a very prescient prognostication by Spengler here. So you be the judge. And he also says, he speaks a little bit about the example of the Chinese Warring States period, which he dates to about 480 BC to 230 BC. And yeah, he brings up this imperialism versus this League of Nations idea in the Warring States period in China. And he says imperialism of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, a very short-lived dynasty, though. The Qin dynasty only lasted for about 20 years. There's two dynasties in Chinese history that are very important that lasted very briefly, the Qin and the Sui. Or Sui, yeah, I think it's second tone. Because the Qin was the first to unite China, and then the Sui reunited China after a long period of disunity for about 350 years-ish, from about 220 AD to about 590 AD, I think. And, and the Sui, they created the Grand Canal between the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers, and they preceded the Tang. So it's very interesting, this kind of Qin-Han relationship and Sui-Tang relationship. So, anyway... so he says imperialism defeats the League of Nations because it's more consonant with the destiny at that point. The destiny at that point is for an imperialism, not for some kind of equal relationship between states. No, the destiny, once we get to the civilized phase, is for one imperial power to conquer all, because these force men, these men with this will to power, this is all that's left of the culture at that point. That's Spengler's view. Excuse me. Now Spengler reiterates the fatalism inherent in his concept of destiny. He says the choice is between willing this type of imperialism and willing nothing at all, between cleaving to this destiny or despairing of the future. And he says, at this point, at this civilized phase where he believes that the West is in the 19th and 20th centuries, one must appreciate the grandeur of techno-industrial will to power rather than look back longingly at the idealism of the provincial. So Spengler, in his heart, he likes this art history, I think, very much. He wants, in a way, to go back to all that, but he views it very fatalistically, that we're destined to just be in these imperial power struggles. And obviously this is a very attractive message in World War I and in the aftermath, because that's exactly what these people had seen. So his book seems very prescient in that context. And then he says, one who wants to actually have a historical impact during this civilization phase must forego all desire to comprehend history, to live through history, or to make history. Because again, he views this as becoming an ahistorical period, because there's no longer... Well, I mean, it's kind of tough to understand his concept of the ahistorical, and it's kind of tough to entertain it because, even if it is just animal life forces of these imperial powers fighting against each other with no inward artistic religious significance, for us it's still of historical importance, we would think. But for him, history is over by the civilization phase. All the interesting questions of history to him for each culture have already been decided. The culture is the thing become. It has fully realized itself by this point. And so these fights between would-be Caesars are just, they're of little importance to Spengler at this point. And one might ask, is this contradictory with Oswald Spengler's own life? Because, he's a high school history teacher, basically, who writes these long books about his theories of history, marshaling all this evidence from the classical world and from other historical epochs. And, is he not true to himself here? Well, maybe. But on the other hand, maybe he just doesn't view himself as of that much historic importance. But there's some other things in his work where he really does view himself, not himself in kind of an egotistical way. He views himself as just a symptom of the times, and he views himself as like a vessel for the times to speak through him. So, I don't know, just kind of an interesting point. On to the next point. He says, the secret of historical form is only revealed by these deeper relationships that his morphology can unveil, and that's obviously very common for him. But he goes on page 51 of this edition to describe some superficial similarities and dissimilarities between certain epochs, and he also compares this to biological phenomena. And there is some truth to that, right? Like, Aristotle thought that dolphins and whales were a type of fish, but that's not true, right? They just have this superficial similarity to fish. So I wanted to quote from here. He says, the secret of historical form does not lie on the surface. It cannot be grasped by means of similarities of costume and setting. The history of men, as in that of animals and plants, is shown through phenomena of deceptive similarity, but inwardly without any connection. So he says some deceptively similar phenomena are Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid, Alexander and Caesar, the German wars upon Rome, and the Mongol onslaughts upon Western Europe. But he says other phenomena of extreme outward dissimilarity are actually of identical import. So he says Trajan and Ramesses II. So these would be kind of later civilizational emperors, kind of these late good emperors, you could say. Trajan is famous as one of the 5 good emperors of the 2nd century AD. I think Marcus Aurelius goes into the 3rd century AD. But anyway, and then Ramesses II is obviously a very famous Egyptian pharaoh, although I believe he did put his name on like temples that he didn't even build. Like he did a lot of weird stuff like that. And then he says the Bourbons and the Attic demos. So these would be kind of spring, summertime phenomena in the classical and the Western, respectively. So the Bourbon, the great French dynasty, Louis XIV, obviously the top of that, and then the Attic demos. That's the great era of Athenian democracy and the height of Athenian art. And then he says Muhammad and Pythagoras are one last pair of extreme outward dissimilarity, but identical import. So he views Muhammad, Pythagoras, and the Puritans as kind of identical phenomena. So this kind of basically a summertime phenomenon of any culture, and a very religious revivalist phenomenon. So he actually has a whole chapter about that in volume 2. I believe it's called like Muhammad, Pythagoras, and Cromwell or something like that. So So I don't know. It's just an interesting thing to think about. I don't think he obviously proves any of these things with mathematical certainty, and he wouldn't expect that. That would be applying the causality principle, where you should only apply the destiny principle. That would be applying world as nature, where you can only apply world as history. Now, is that just a cop-out for him? Who knows? But, it's interesting comparisons. Anyway, on to the last point here. Our own time represents a transitional phase which occurs with certainty under particular conditions. So he views the 19th and 20th century as this phase shift in the winter of the culture between culture and civilization. He says, the West is not a limitless tending upwards and onwards for all time towards our present ideals, but a single phenomenon of history, strictly limited and defined as to form and duration, which can be viewed and in essentials calculated from available precedents. So that's a real nutshell of his view of his morphological approach. No culture can go on forever. It's strictly limited in its lifespan. They're all singular phenomena of history. They're not connected in his view whatsoever. They're all discrete, which I think is a very difficult thing to say because prior cultures do form the building blocks for later cultures, as even his concept of the pseudomorphosis somewhat admits, but you'll see that he kind of tries to use the pseudomorphosis to explain away things like that. And I would just bring up here, he did have an abortive book that he tried. His great effort after Decline of the West was toward something that was to be called the dawn of civilization. And he didn't really... Yeah, it was called the dawn. Yeah, the dawn of civilization, not the birth of civilization. I messed up that when I was trying to translate birth of tragedy on the spot. It should be Die Geburt der Tragödie. And then there's also this part about music in Nietzsche's work. But... In English, it's always just translated as the birth of tragedy. But, so Spengler's later work, after he finishes the 2 volumes of Decline of the West, his big ambition was to investigate a problem that he puts to one side in Decline of the West, which is the problem of ethnogenesis, the problem of the genesis of these high cultures. How do they develop? He views it as an incident, and we've learned earlier that, he's got causality, destiny, and incident. These are kind of the 3, in this broader sense, causes for any historical phenomenon that we could look at. And he views the birth of any high culture as basically incident, or in an epistemological sense, incident. It's something that we couldn't understand. That's his position in Decline of the West. It's something that there's just not enough evidence and that our minds aren't sharp enough to truly understand. But he did start a project, which I believe he spent years of his life on, for a book called The Dawn of Civilization. And he ended up having to give up on it, kind of like how David Foster Wallace basically gave up on his last novel and killed himself. Now, Spengler doesn't actively kill himself. He dies of a heart attack, but who knows how much his kind of writer's block, we could say, impacted his blood pressure and things of that nature. But it is interesting that he kind of gives up on that project, because I think if he were to go deeper into that project, and as he went deeper into that project, he probably realized more and more the contradictions inherent in his thesis in Decline of the West. Now, that's speculation on my part, but I don't think it's unreasonable speculation. Anyway, back to this. So and they're strictly limited and defined as to form and duration. So the form is going to be strictly limited by the prime symbol of each high culture, and the duration is limited by the necessity that any organism, which he posits that all high cultures are, by the necessity that any organism has a lifespan. So very thought-provoking and pretty good stuff. But looking back, is the way that he's so thought-provoking, is it more what do I want to say exactly? Does it speak more to his greatness, or does it speak more to the mediocrity of a typical history? Because my view is it actually speaks more to the mediocrity of a typical history, because the idea that the West is not a limitless tending upwards and onwards for all time towards our present ideals, that's actually a commonplace, if you think about it. I mean, if anybody is willing to think about that for 2 seconds, you realize, well, of course, right? Because all good things come to an end. In English, we would just say all good things come to an end. Sure, the West has been this great phenomenon, and it's made tremendous contributions to the world, but any phenomenon of history is going to have a growth phase and then the decline phase, just like the Roman Empire, just like great Chinese dynasties, just like great Islamic caliphates, just like the Egyptian civilization. So how much is that actually that much of an earth-shattering idea? I mean, it is, I think, because it's easier for us to accept that our own lives are limited. It's easier for us to accept that any smaller phenomenon might be limited, but to accept that your whole culture is actually a limited phenomenon, that even, the Christian church might not be around it someday. I mean, that is for a lot of people would be, or that the Islam might not be around at some point in the future. I mean, that's very, very threatening to somebody's psychological well-being. So maybe Spengler is just more willing to confront things that other people wouldn't confront because of kind of the psychological pain of it. But, looking from 2023 with everything that's happened, I mean, this is kind of not that bad, right? I mean, the idea that the West might fall, that even the United States of America, will eventually fall at some point. The People's Republic of China will eventually fall at some point. These, to me, are just complete commonplaces. I hope that the decline and fall of the United States of America is forestalled for as long as possible, and that more people can be positively impacted by the ideals of our Constitution and the fine craftsmanship of the sages of 1787. But all good things come to an end. And I just bring up, this is not just an English-speaking idea. So in French, it would be toutes les bonnes choses ont une fin. All good things have an end. And in Chinese, it is 天下无不散的宴席. So every banquet comes to an end. Under heaven, every banquet has an end. Quite literally, it's under heaven, there are no banquets without an end. And for Chinese people, a banquet is like the greatest thing on earth. For us, the way we would think about like a ball game or a concert, like they just love a big banquet where you're drinking your baijiao and you're, everybody's there. And I mean, a lot of it is just kind of this tuanyuan idea. Like everybody needs to be here, man. We all need to come together. And I think that's a beautiful thing. That's something I miss about China. There's a lot of lovable things about China, as much as the Communist Party has done to harm the nation. But anyway, thanks so much for listening, and have a great day. Thanks.